We fought a war 250 years ago to depose a king who tried to impose his will on a young country. We don't have a king today because it conflicts with the very genius of a democracy, where the voices and the votes of the people, not a king, not a queen, and not a governor, should prevail.
That was the governor of New York today, still angry after Donald Trump proclaimed himself a king, literally, in social media posting announcing his intent to veto a New York City law, overrule it that is, that has successfully reduced traffic jams in New York City, the most local of issues. And it is worth pausing for a moment to consider all those people who just repeatedly told you last year that Joe Biden was just too old to be president. Joe Biden's brain just wasn't working sharply enough to be president. Declaring yourself to be a king and including a doctored picture of you wearing a gold crown is the kind of thing you would use to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone doesn't have the mental capacity to serve as president of the United States or any other elective office. Imagine if Joe Biden had ever done anything like that. Of course, it is unimaginable. It's unimaginable that any president other than Donald Trump would have ever done anything like that, including Woodrow Wilson, whose mental capacity was severely diminished in his second term as president, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose health was fading rapidly in his final year of the presidency while he was still successfully strategizing victory in World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in office in 1945 on his very last day of life. At his weakest, he was immeasurably smarter than Donald Trump and most other presidents of the United States. Every time Donald Trump speaks now, it becomes obvious that this country and the world would be much better off if Joe Biden were still president. Joe Biden would not be tweeting pictures of himself wearing a crown and calling himself a king and trying to overrule local laws in cities about traffic, cities that didn't vote for him. That is how Governor Hochul began her press conference today, in which she announced the inevitable. She would not use her power as governor to just begin a process to try to remove the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, who Donald Trump has decided should no longer be a criminal defendant. Mayor Adams is facing federal charges of bribery, but because he is willing to help Donald Trump's mass deportation program, Donald Trump has told the Justice Department to drop the charges against Mayor Adams, but make sure that you can always bring those charges back anytime you want if the mayor doesn't cooperate with us. A judge is now considering that motion. Obviously, meaning anytime the mayor says or does anything that Donald Trump doesn't like, they would throw those charges at that mayor again. Residents of New York City do not want Donald Trump to be their real mayor. And according to the polls, they do not want Eric Adams to be their mayor anymore either. The governor of New York has only the theoretical power to remove the mayor of New York from office. It has remained a theoretical power for 235 years because no governor has ever tried to use it. The governor would have to initiate a hearing where the governor would have to sit as a judge for every minute of that hearing, while the governor was also serving as the prosecutor for every minute of that hearing, presenting the evidence against Eric Adams. And in the end of that hearing, whenever that might be, because Eric Adams is allowed to call as many witnesses as he wants, at the end of that hearing, the governor alone would serve as the jury in that hearing, rendering the final verdict on whether to remove the mayor. And all of that could end up being a subject of a legal appeal to the courts, and the mayor could take that appeal all the way to the United States Supreme Court. That could take years. So this theoretical process by which the governor could remove the mayor might actually take years. There's no possibility for the governor to just summarily fire the mayor. Everyone who's told you the governor can fire the mayor is wrong and does not understand New York law. In fact, none of the local officials that the governor consulted urged her to try to begin that untested and possibly very long removal process.
After careful consideration, I have determined that I will not commence removal proceedings at this time.
Governor Hochul pointed out that if she was able to quickly remove the mayor, even though she would have no access to the criminal evidence against the mayor assembled by the FBI, New York City could end up with 3 different mayors just this year. The line of succession would first go to the city's public advocate, but a special election would then have to be scheduled for mayor even before the already scheduled 4-year election for mayor, which is actually scheduled for this November.
I also have concerns about disruption and chaos that such a move, such a proceeding could bring to the residents of this great city. And those who argue just go and remove them fail to appreciate there is a process involved. Due process, the length of the process, and the impact that such a process would have on this city. And actually, with the timing, it's not impossible that we'd have a scenario where there's multiple mayors of this city in the course of 1 year.
Most reports of this situation, including even in the New York Times, do not specify the complexity of the process the governor would have to preside over to remove the mayor, not to mention how long such a process would take and that the mayor could appeal it to the courts. So most New Yorkers have been badly informed by the news media and given the belief that the governor can simply fire the mayor immediately, which is not true and has never been true. Instead, today, Governor Hochul outlined 3 quick changes in law that she would like to see enacted by the city of New York and the state legislature for just the rest of this year that would tightly monitor the current mayor of New York City.
We are taking a number of steps that give us line of sight into budgetary matters, investigative matters, and legal matters to ensure that there's no area where any decisions can be compromised.
The governor said Donald Trump's abuse of the criminal justice system to, in effect, blackmail the mayor of New York City is all part of what she called the Trump revenge tour.
The Trump administration has said is already trying to use the legal jeopardy facing our mayor as leverage to squeeze and punish our city. The president's already trying to weaken our public transit system and undermine our state sovereignty. I call it the Trump revenge tour, and I have to stand in its way.